Okay, so the last subtopic in Unit 6 that we're going to talk about is 6.7 Effects of Migration. And the thematic focus for this is SIO, social interactions and organizations. So, some keywords you should be looking for when you're reading include gender roles, social hierarchy, racial and ethnic constructs, and some questions you can use in your notes. How are people divided or organized? How do people interact within society? And how does status impact the roles or opportunities of individuals? So, contextualization for this unit, remember it's happening at the same time as Unit 5, which is a lot of revolutions, especially the Industrial Revolution. And we really went into detail on contextualizing this unit at the beginning of Unit 6 if you need to go back and watch that video. So, the essential question for this one: in what ways were migrants and their families impacted, and how did these migrants cope with the economic systems around the globe during the time period between 1750 to 1900? So, to elaborate on this question, let's go to Africa. So, for example, women coped by seeking closer relationships with their families of birth as opposed to the families of their absentee husbands. Women introduced labor saving crops, new farm tools, and some even earned money as traders in Africa. They did establish self help groups to help each other. Some were even able to become economically independent of their husbands, such as of those in northern Nigeria, for example. Women of poor rural families sought new jobs in mission schools, towns, and mines in order to escape the restrictions of a rural patriarchy. In response, though, some men used increasing accusations of witchcraft and petitioned colonial governments for laws and regulations that would penalize women for adultery and hinder their ability to leave rural villages. Our next slide is our key concepts. We have three of them here. So, first, we have migrants tended to be male, leaving women to take on new roles in the home society that had been formerly occupied by men. So, during a period of time, these women were used to work at factories, mainly due to the factory owners not having to pay them as much. This was also true with child labor, didn't have to pay them very much either. But as time progressed, male immigrants assumed position because of the physical nature and demands of the work, which pushed women back to the role of keeping up the home and caring for children. In the Caribbean, the abolition of slavery caused a labor shortage where Indian migration rose to compensate for this. Since most of these migrants were male, it altered gender relations in the islands and in their countries of origin, where women faced increasing workloads in their absence. In Africa, women nearly everywhere were farmers before the colonial period. Women shared a measure of economic autonomy. However, as the colonial economy swelled, the lives of women diverged greatly from that of men. Our next key concept: migrants often created ethnic enclaves in different parts of the world that helped transplant their culture into new environments. So, some examples of migrant ethnic enclaves in different parts of the world include the Chinese in Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, South America, North America. The Chinese really were displaced to many different parts of the world. This also includes Indians in East and Southern Africa, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia. When immigrants were slow to naturalize, meaning when they were slow to assimilate into their receiving country or culture, movements sprung up in reaction, claiming that migrants were outsiders. In America, many developed stereotypes and prejudices against immigrants, coupled with a need to find something familiar. Immigrants often felt like they needed to be with other immigrants from their country. Many cities developed sections where certain immigrants from one country or another lived, so ethnic enclaves. Another area of destination for Africans and Asians were the cities of the colonial world: Lagos, Nairobi, Cairo, Calcutta, Rangoon, Batavia, Singapore, and Saigon. They were often racially segregated, unsanitary, and overcrowded. They were still seen as meccas of opportunity, though, for all people of social backgrounds. Our last key concept: Receiving societies did not always embrace immigrants, as seen in the various degrees of ethnic and racial prejudice, and the ways states attempted to regulate the increased flow of people across their borders. The Chinese were often discriminated against, including European immigrants. Your Strayer uses the example of Dennis Kearney, who promoted an anti immigrant labor campaign, and he was actually born in Ireland and immigrated to the United States, yet he is going to be against Chinese immigrants. So, examples of the regulation of immigrants include the Chinese Exclusion Acts. As the numbers of Chinese laborers increased, so did the strength of anti Chinese sentiment among other workers in the American economy. This finally resulted in legislation that aimed to limit future immigration of Chinese workers to the U.S. and threatened to sour diplomatic relations between the U.S. and China. There was also the White Australia policy. So in 1901, Australia passed an act preventing the immigration of Asians known as the White Australia policy, initially directed at preventing Chinese immigration. However, it would later discriminate against Japanese, especially following Japanese occupation of China in the late 1800s. Australia's primary fear turned more towards the Japanese. Fearing a military strike by Japan, they passed an anti-immigration act which restricted immigration to almost exclusively white Europeans. And lastly, how did the policies of colonial powers change the economic lives of their subjects? And you can find the answer to this in your Strayer on page 894. It's causation here. For example, forced labor was happening in the Netherlands, East Indies, Indonesia during the 19th century, where peasants were required to cultivate 20% or more of their land in cash crops, such as sugar or coffee, to meet their tax obligations to the government. This cultivation system proved to be greatly beneficial to the Dutch government, helping it to avoid taxing its own people and providing capital for its own industrial revolution. People of the Belgian Congo experienced extremely harsh policies set forth by King Leopold II of Belgium. We've touched on this before, where he forced villagers to collect rubber. That included a reign of terror and abuse that took approximately 8 million Congolese lives. These horrors were eventually publicized in Europe, which then forced the Belgian government to take control of the Congo in 1908, ending Leopold's abuses. And that, on depressing note, ends 6.7 SIO.